Today I'm going to tell you a story that still keeps me up some nights. So real it stings, so quiet it screams. Picture this. Late autumn, Silver Gulch, Montana. Snow just starting to dust the rooftops. An old man sits outside the general store, hands shaking so bad the coffee spills every time he lifts the cup. Folks walk by, nod, move on. He's just there. Then 5 hard men ride in, faces scarred, eyes cold, guns loose in holsters. It starts with nothing more than a boy asking the wrong question, and blood on the boards. And suddenly the old man isn't just shaking anymore. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The late autumn wind carried the sharp bite of pine and dust down Main Street, Silver Gulch. It rattled the loose boards of the boardwalk and tugged at the faded sign above Whitaker's General Store. Elias Harlan sat in the old rocker just outside the door, the same chair he'd claimed every afternoon for 13 years. The wood groaned under his slight weight as he lifted the tin cup to his lips. Coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he drank anyway. Slow, careful, the way a man drinks when every swallow costs him something. His right hand trembled, not the quick shiver of cold, but the deep, stubborn tremor that had settled into bone and sinew after Appomattox and never left. The cup rattled against his teeth. A few dark drops spilled onto the faded plaid of his shirt. He wiped them with the back of his sleeve, eyes never leaving the empty stretch of street. Inside the store, Jed Whitaker moved tins along a shelf, the soft clink of metal the only sound breaking the hush. Young Billy was somewhere in back, sweeping. Elias could hear the broom's steady whisper. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Then came the hoofbeats. They started faint. 5 sets, deliberate, not hurried. Elias didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. The rhythm told him everything. Heavy horses, riders who knew how to sit a saddle without wasting motion. Outlaws, or men who wished they were. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of horse sweat, leather, and gun oil. They rode past slow. Elias kept the cup raised, pretending to sip. Through the steam that no longer rose, he watched them from under the brim of his hat. 5 men in dusters dark with trail dirt. The leader sat tallest, Caleb Blackjack Harlan, though Elias didn't know the name yet. A jagged scar ran from temple to jaw, old enough to be white at the edges. Cold eyes swept the street like a man counting cattle. Those eyes paused on Elias. Not long. 3 heartbeats, maybe 4. Long enough for Elias to feel the weight of recognition without knowing why. The man's gaze lingered on the trembling hand, on the tin cup, on the old man who looked like every other broken prospector the mountains had chewed up and spat out. Elias stared at the coffee's black surface. His pulse knocked against his throat, steady but loud in his ears. Joey's voice drifted up unbidden, soft as it had been that last morning outside Gettysburg. "Wind's the same here as Montana, Reaper. Carries the smell of dying before the shooting even starts." Elias closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them again. The riders had passed. He exhaled through his nose, slow, set the cup on the arm of the rocker. His fingers shook harder now. He folded them into a fist and pressed it against his thigh until the knuckles whitened. Inside, Jed's voice drifted out. "You all right out there, Elias?" "Fine," Elias answered. The word came flat, automatic. He didn't move. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. Boots hit the dirt in front of the saloon. A horse snorted. Someone laughed, low, easy, the laugh of a man who already owned the ground he stood on. Elias kept his eyes on the empty street. The wind pushed a tumbleweed past his boots. It caught on the rocker's leg and spun once before rolling on. He heard the bat-wing doors of the saloon creak open, then slap shut. Silence returned, thicker now. Elias reached for the cup again. His hand shook so badly that more coffee sloshed over the rim. He let it fall to the boards. The dark stain spread slowly, soaking into the dry wood. Across the street, Lin Mai Nguyen appeared in the doorway of her laundry. She stood still, arms folded, watching the saloon. After a moment, she lifted her eyes to Elias. Their gazes met. She gave the smallest nod, barely a movement, then stepped back inside and closed the door. Elias looked down at his hands. The tremor hadn't stopped. If anything, it had deepened, traveling up his forearms like a slow current. He could walk away, go inside, help Jed stack the last of the flour sacks, play checkers with Billy when the boy finished sweeping. Tomorrow the 5 riders would ride out. Towns like Silver Gulch saw men like them every season. They drank, they took what they wanted, they left. Most times they left before anyone bled. Most times. But that look, the way the scarred man's eyes had caught on him, had landed like a stone in still water. Ripples were already moving outward. Elias felt them in his chest. He leaned forward. The rocker creaked. From the saloon came the sound of chairs being dragged, boots on pine, a bottle uncorked. Laughter again, louder this time. Elias stayed where he was. The sun dropped another handspan behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long across the street, turning the dust gold at the edges. The wind picked up, colder now, carrying the faint smell of pine smoke from someone's supper fire. And then the scarred man, Caleb, stepped out onto the saloon porch. He paused there, thumbs hooked in his belt, and turned his head slowly until he faced the general store, until he faced Elias. This time the look lasted longer. No words, no gesture, just the weight of eyes meeting across 40 yards of empty street. Elias didn't look away. His right hand closed around the arm of the rocker. The wood bit into his palm. Somewhere deep in his memory, Joey Kane laughed once. Soft, rueful. Winds changed, Reaper. Smells like trouble now. Elias swallowed. The taste of cold coffee lingered on his tongue. He stayed seated. But the stone in the water had already begun to sink. The night settled over Silver Gulch like a heavy wool blanket, cold and thick with the smell of pine resin and coal smoke. Lanterns flickered inside the few buildings still showing light, their yellow glow spilling in weak pools onto the boardwalk. Most folks had already shuttered their doors, drawn curtains tight against the wind that moaned through the eaves. Elias Harlan stood in the narrow alley between the feed store and the livery, 40 yards from the saloon's front windows. The shadows swallowed him whole. He leaned one shoulder against the rough plank wall, arms folded tight across his chest to still the shaking in his hands. The tremor had deepened since sundown. Now it felt like someone had tied a string to his fingers and was pulling from the inside. Through the saloon's big front windows, he could see everything. 5 men at the center table. Caleb Blackjack Harlan sat with his back to the wall, scarred face lit by the hanging oil lamp. He nursed a bottle of rye, slow and deliberate. Rufus lounged beside him, pearl-handled Colt resting on the tabletop, thumb idly stroking the grip like a man petting a favorite dog. The other 3, Cleet, Hank, Luther, sprawled in chairs, boots up, laughing too loud at nothing. Clara Beaumont moved behind the bar, face pale but steady. She poured drinks without looking at them too long. Elias watched her hands, steady, practiced. She'd buried a husband in the silver pit 3 winters back. She knew how to keep moving when the world turned ugly. Caleb leaned forward, voice carrying through the thin glass. "That old man outside the general store today," he said, not loud, but clear enough. "The one with the shakes. Who is he?" Clara wiped a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "Just Elias. Been here 13 years. Keeps to himself. Rufus snorted, twirling the Colt once around his finger. Looks familiar, like somebody I heard tell of once. Run-down sharpshooter type. Union, maybe. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He didn't smile. Ask around tomorrow. Quiet-like. Elias felt the name hit him like a cold slap. His hands jerked inside his coat pockets. The tremor climbed his arms, hot and insistent. He pressed his back harder against the wall, breathing shallow through his nose. Inside, one of the miners at the far table tried to stand. Hank Dutch Malone shoved him back down with the flat of his palm. Sit. You owe for the week's protection. $2, cash. The miner hesitated. Rufus laughed, sharp and mean. Or we take it out of your hide. Your choice, friend. Clara's rag stopped moving. She glanced toward the window, toward the dark where Elias stood. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there. Everyone in town knew Elias watched things from the shadows. They just never asked why. Footsteps scuffed behind him. Elias tensed. Young Billy Whitaker stepped out of the alley mouth, broom still in his hand. The boy's face was flushed from running. 16 years old, and still carrying too much hope in his eyes. Mr. Elias, Billy whispered, voice cracking a little. Those men in the saloon, they're asking about you. Pa says they look like trouble. Who are they? Elias didn't turn. Go home, Billy. But go home. The words came out harsher than he meant, edged with the fear he couldn't quite swallow. Now. Billy flinched. The broom handle creaked in his grip. For a second, the boy looked like he might argue. Then his shoulders slumped. He backed away, eyes wide and hurt, the way a kid looks when the man he trusts suddenly turns cold. Elias watched him disappear down the alley. Something twisted low in his gut. He'd just broken the one small trust he still had left in this town. Across the street, the door of Lynn, Mai, and Gwen's laundry opened a crack. She stood in the frame, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Their eyes met again. She gave one slow nod, small, certain, then closed the door without a sound. Inside the saloon, laughter swelled. Rufus stood, stretched, holster creaking. He sauntered toward the bat-wing doors, pushing them open with both hands. Elias held his breath. Rufus stepped onto the porch. Moonlight caught the pearl grips of his Colt. He scanned the street slow, head cocked like a hound catching scent. Then his gaze settled on the alley, on the patch of shadow where Elias stood. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Rufus grinned, teeth flashing white. He raised the Colt skyward, thumbed back the hammer, and fired once. The crack split the night. Powder smoke drifted lazy on the wind. Somewhere a dog barked. A horse stamped in the livery. Elias didn't flinch, didn't run. He stayed rooted, heart hammering against his ribs, hands clenched so tight his nails bit into palms. Rufus lowered the gun, still smiling. He spoke just loud enough to carry. Thought I saw something move out there. He turned and walked back inside. The door slapped shut behind him. Elias exhaled, slow and ragged. The tremor in his hands had become a steady quake now, traveling up his arms to his shoulders. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the wall, eyes closed. The shot still echoed in his ears, sharp, final, like the crack of a whip. He could walk away, go home, bar the door, wait for morning. They might leave tomorrow. They might not ask again. Most times, trouble passed through and kept going. But that shot hadn't been random. It had been a question. And Elias knew, deep in the place where Joey Kane's voice still lived, that questions like that only got louder if you didn't answer. He opened his eyes, looked toward the saloon windows, where lantern light still danced on scarred faces and pearl-handled steel. Then he looked down at his shaking hands. The wind picked up again, colder, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and something darker underneath. Elias straightened. He took one step backward, deeper into shadow, but he didn't turn toward home. The morning sun came up pale and thin over the ridge, the kind of light that promised no warmth. Silver Gulch woke slow, the way towns do when trouble has already spent the night. Smoke from last night's fires still hung low, mixing with the smell of fresh horse dung and damp pine. Main Street looked the same as always. Dusty boards, shuttered windows, the faint creak of signs swinging in the breeze. But the air felt heavier, like the whole place was holding its breath. Elias Harlan stood under the awning of his small house at the edge of town, one hand braced on the porch rail. He hadn't slept. The tremor in his fingers had kept him company all night, rattling the tin cup he'd set beside the bed until he finally gave up and sat in the dark. Now, in daylight, it was worse. Deep, insistent, traveling up his arms like roots seeking water. Across the street, in front of Whitaker's general store, Rufus Harlan had Jed Whitaker by the collar. The boy's father was a big man once, broad from years of hauling crates, but age and hard winters had pared him down. Rufus, younger, meaner, lifted him onto his toes with one fist. The pearl-handled Colt stayed holstered, but the threat was plain in the way Rufus's knuckles whitened. $2, Rufus said, voice carrying clear across the quiet street. Protection for the week. You pay now, or we come back and take it out of your stock. Or your boy. Jed's face flushed red. We ain't got $2 to spare, not after the last vein played out. Rufus laughed, short and sharp. Then you better find it. Clara Beaumont stepped out from the saloon porch, apron still tied, hair loose from a sleepless night. Let him go, Rufus. This town's got nothing left worth taking. Cleet Weasel Boone moved quick. Too quick for a man his size. He shoved Clara hard enough to send her stumbling back against the hitching rail. She caught herself, but the impact jarred a gasp from her throat. A few miners paused on the boardwalk, hands hovering near belts, but no one stepped forward. Elias watched from the shadows of his porch. His grip on the rail tightened until the wood groaned. The tremor shook his whole arm now, knuckles bleaching white against the gray grain. Young Billy burst out of the store door, broom forgotten. Pa! The boy lunged forward, small fists raised like he'd seen in dime novels. Rufus turned, casual as swatting a fly, and backhanded him across the face. The crack echoed off the false front buildings. Billy staggered, blood blooming bright from his nose, dripping in fat drops onto the weathered planks. He didn't cry out, just stood there, stunned, one hand cupped to his face, eyes wide with the sudden understanding that the world could hurt without warning. Elias felt it in his chest like a fist closing. The boy's blood on the wood looked black in the morning light. Joey Kane's voice came then, clear and close, the way it always did when the guilt rose sharpest. Don't let some kid die for you, Reaper. You already got enough ghosts. Elias's breath caught. He remembered the boy in blue at Antietam, 16, same wide eyes, same stupid courage, crumpling when the mini-ball found him. Elias had been too far to reach him, too far to do anything but watch. He squeezed the rail harder. Splinters bit into his palm. Across the street, Rufus shoved Jed back against the wall. Tell your boy to stay inside next time. And you, $2 by sundown, or we start collecting in other ways. Jed nodded once, defeated. Billy wiped his nose on his sleeve, smearing red across his cheek, and backed toward the door. His eyes flicked once toward Elias's porch, searching, hurt, questioning. Elias looked away first. The street had gone quiet. A few folks whispered now, heads together on the boardwalk. That old man with the shakes, one miner muttered to another, voice low but carrying on the still air. "They're asking about him. Say he looks like trouble, like one of them Union sharpshooters from the war." The other man spat tobacco juice. "Could be. Seen men like that before. Hands shake when they ain't holding iron." Elias heard every word. The tremor climbed into his shoulders, hot and relentless. He wanted to step inside, bar the door, pretend the whispers weren't about him. Pretend the boy's blood wasn't on his conscience. But he couldn't look away. Caleb Blackjack Harlan stepped out of the saloon then, coat open, thumbs hooked in his belt. He took in the scene. Jed against the wall, Billy bleeding, Clara rubbing her shoulder, and nodded once, satisfied. He walked over slow, boots deliberate on the boards, stopped beside Rufus. "Enough," Caleb said quietly. "We made our point." Rufus grinned, wiping his hand on his pants like he'd touched something dirty. Caleb turned his head, eyes sweeping the street until they landed on Elias's porch. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the dust. Then Caleb spoke, voice carrying just far enough. "Tonight," he said to Rufus, but loud enough for the street to hear. "Bring that old man with the shakes to the saloon. I want to ask him a few questions myself." Rufus laughed again, softer this time. "Yes, sir." Caleb held Elias's gaze another second, long enough to make it clear this wasn't a request, then turned and walked back inside. The bat-wing doors slapped shut behind him. The street exhaled. Elias stayed where he was. His hands still gripped the rail, white-knuckled, shaking so hard the whole porch seemed to vibrate with them. Billy looked at him again from the store doorway, blood drying dark on his upper lip, eyes full of something that hadn't been there yesterday. Betrayal, maybe, or fear, or both. Elias felt the weight of that look settle into his bones. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. But the cold in his chest only deepened. He let go of the rail. His hands dropped to his sides, still trembling. Somewhere in the quiet of his mind, Joey's voice whispered one last time, "You gonna let it happen again?" Elias didn't answer. But he didn't step back inside, either. He just stood there, watching the street, listening to the whispers grow louder, feeling the noose of his past tighten one slow inch at a time. The sun bled red across the ridge as it sank, painting the sky in streaks of rust and bruise. Shadows stretched long over Elias Harlan's small house at the far end of Silver Gulch, turning the yard into a patchwork of black and dying gold. Inside, the single room smelled of old pine, cold coffee, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil that had lingered in the floorboards for 13 years. Elias sat at the scarred oak table, elbows planted, hands flat against the wood. They shook worse than ever, deep, rhythmic tremors that made the tin cup in front of him rattle like a telegraph key. He stared at the loose plank beneath the table leg, the one he'd never nailed down, the one that hid the past. Hoofbeats approached from the street. 2 horses, slow and deliberate. Elias didn't need to look out the window to know who rode them. A fist pounded on the front door. 3 heavy knocks. "Old man," Rufus Harlan's voice came through the planks, laced with that same mocking drawl. "Blackjack wants a word. Don't make us drag you out like a steer to the brand." Elias didn't answer. He listened instead. Boots shifting on the porch, the soft creak of leather as Rufus adjusted his weight, the metallic click of a hammer being thumbed back on a pearl-handled Colt. Through the narrow gap in the shutters, he saw the glint of it, moonlight catching the ivory grips. Behind Rufus, Cleet Weasel Boone held a coil of rope, looping it idly around one fist. They weren't asking. Elias exhaled, slow and ragged. His right hand slid under the table, fingers finding the edge of the loose plank. He pried it up. The wood groaned, louder than he wanted. Dust motes drifted into the lamplight. Beneath lay the oiled cloth bundle. He lifted it out with both hands, careful, reverent, the way a man lifts something he both loves and hates. The Sharps rifle felt heavier than memory. The stock was worn smooth from years of use and longer years of hiding. He unwrapped it slowly, cloth whispering against walnut. The tremor surged. His fingers fumbled the first screw. The barrel nearly slipped. He caught it against his chest, breathing hard. Joey's voice rose unbidden, soft and steady as it had been in the rifle pit at Spotsylvania. If you're holding iron again, Reaper, it means the world didn't let you quit. So what are you going to do with it? Elias closed his eyes. A spike of pain lanced through his temples, sharp, familiar. The kind that came when the memories crowded too close. Gettysburg, Antietam, the smell of black powder and blood and wet earth. Joey's last breath rattling in his throat. He opened his eyes. Joey, he whispered to the empty room, voice cracking on the name. If you're still here, what would you tell me to do? No answer came. Only the wind rattling the shutters and the impatient stomp of a horse outside. He began assembling the rifle, mechanical, practiced, even with the shaking. Stock to barrel, breech block, ramrod. Each motion cost him. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His breath came short. The pain behind his eyes pulsed brighter. But the pieces fit. They always did. A soft knock at the back door. 3 light taps. Elias froze. The door eased open an inch. Lin Mai Nguyen slipped inside, shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. She carried a folded length of dark wool cloth. Her eyes flicked to the rifle, then to his face. No surprise, only quiet understanding. She crossed the room without a word, set the cloth on the table beside the Sharps. For the walk, she murmured, voice low. Wrap it. No one will see. Elias looked at her. You shouldn't be here. Mai's gaze didn't waver. If you go to the saloon, they win without firing a shot. If you stay... She let the sentence hang. Tang Hai Tiem Toi, 2nd floor. Wind steady from the west. Good sight lines. She turned to leave. Mai? She paused at the door. Thank you, he said. The words came out rough, almost lost. She gave the smallest nod, the same one she'd given him from her doorway nights before, then slipped out into the dark. Elias wrapped the rifle in the wool. It looked like nothing more than a long bundle of laundry now. He stood, knees creaking, and moved to the back door. Outside, the yard was empty. Rufus and Cleet were still at the front, voices low, impatient. He stepped into the twilight, rifle cradled against his side like a child he no longer wanted to carry. The wind caught the edge of his coat, cold fingers brushing his neck. He didn't look back at the house. Didn't need to. The life he'd built there, the quiet mornings, the rocker on the porch, the small rituals that kept the ghosts at bay, was already gone. If he walked through that front door now, he'd walk into a trap. If he fought here, the whole town would pay in blood before dawn. So he moved sideways, along the fence line, staying in the deepest shadows. Toward Lin Mai's laundry, toward the 2nd floor window that overlooked the saloon. The hoofbeats of Rufus and Cleet faded as they circled back toward the main street, still expecting him to open the door like a lamb. Elias kept walking. The bundle grew heavier with every step. Not from weight, but from what it meant. The old road, the one of hiding, of trembling hands and cold coffee and pretending the war had ended, was closed behind him. There was only forward now. And the night waited, patient as death, for whatever came next. The 2nd floor of Lin Mai Nguyen's laundry smelled of lye soap and starched cotton. sharp and clean against the night's gathering smoke. Elias lay prone on the rough plank floor, belly to the boards, the bipod legs of the Sharp's rifle resting steady on a stack of folded sheets. The big front window stood open a crack, just enough for the barrel to clear the sill without catching moonlight. 40 yards below, the saloon's porch lanterns threw jittery orange pools across Main Street. He had the rifle settled, cheek welded to the stock, eye pressed to the brass scope. The world narrowed to a perfect circle of light and shadow. Rufus Harlan stood near the hitching rail, a bottle of coal oil in one hand, the other resting on the pearl-handled Colt. He tilted the bottle, let a slow stream splash against the nearest porch post. The liquid glistened black in the lantern glow. Elias's breathing came slow, deliberate. Inhale 4 counts, hold 4, exhale 4. The old rhythm from the rifle pits at Chancellorsville, when the world had been nothing but mud and powder smoke and the whisper of Joey Kane counting windage. It still worked. His hands, miraculously, had steadied the instant the rifle touched his shoulder. The tremor was gone, pushed down deep where it waited to return. Behind him, Mai stood in the doorway to the back room. She didn't speak at first. Then, soft as a prayer, the Vietnamese words began. Low, rhythmic, the same cadence she'd used years ago in the field hospitals when the stretchers came in faster than the surgeons could cut. Elias didn't understand the meaning, only the sound. Steady, unhurried, like water over stone. Down on the porch, Caleb Blackjack Harlan stepped out, dragging Clara Beaumont by the upper arm. She stumbled once but didn't cry out. He shoved her in front of him, using her body like a shield, one forearm across her throat, not tight enough to choke, just enough to remind her who held the power. Old man with the shakes. Caleb's voice rolled out over the empty street, deep and carrying. I know you're watching. Come out, or I burn this town to the ground. Every last shack, every last soul. Rufus laughed, short, ugly, and struck a lucifer match against his boot heel. The flame bloomed yellow, cupped in his palm. He held it close to the soaked post, not touching yet, just threatening. The coal oil caught the light and shimmered. Elias shifted the crosshair a hair. Rufus's chest filled the circle. Easy shot. Too easy. He moved the muzzle left, toward Caleb. Clara's face loomed large in the glass, pale, eyes wide but steady. She wasn't begging. She was waiting. Through the scope, Elias saw movement inside the saloon's front window. Young Billy Whitaker, wrists bound behind him, mouth stuffed with a rag. Rufus had shoved the boy against the bar earlier. Now the kid sat slumped on the floor, eyes darting, terrified. The fear in them was raw, animal. Nothing like the brave spark Elias had seen in Billy yesterday. That spark was gone. Maybe forever. The boy would carry this night in his bones long after the bruises faded. Elias's throat tightened. The breathing rhythm faltered for half a count. Mai's prayer continued behind him, unbroken. He swung the crosshair back to Rufus. The match flame danced inches from the post. Wind gusted, 5 knots from the west, just as Mai had said. Elias adjusted for it without thinking. Caleb tightened his grip on Clara. Last chance, Reaper. Show yourself. The name landed like a stone in Elias's gut. Reaper. Not Elias. Not the quiet old man on the porch with the trembling hands. Reaper. Rufus grinned wider. He lowered the match toward the oil-soaked wood. The flame touched. Fire licked up the post in a hungry rush, orange tongues racing toward the porch roof. The dry autumn timber caught fast. Crackling, popping, smoke billowing thick and black. The wind pushed it sideways, carrying sparks toward the hardware store next door. Elias felt the heat even from the second-floor window. His eye never left the scope. Billy's muffled whimper carried through the glass, small, broken. Mai's prayer paused for one heartbeat, then resumed. Elias exhaled 4 counts, his finger curled around the trigger. The sharp spoke. A single, flat crack that rolled down the street like thunder trapped in a canyon. Rufus's chest bloomed red. The match dropped from his fingers, still burning, and landed harmless in the dirt. He staggered back 1 step, surprise frozen on his face, then folded like a cut puppet. The pearl-handled Colt clattered to the boards. The saloon porch fire kept growing, fed by wind and dry wood. Elias worked the breech block. The spent brass pinged against the floorboards behind him. Down below, chaos erupted. Caleb shoved Clara aside and dove for cover behind the bar rail. Shouts, boots pounding. The fire roared louder, sparks swirling upward like angry fireflies. Elias shifted the muzzle, searching for the next target. The night had only just begun to burn. The fire on the saloon porch had grown teeth, crackling, hungry, spitting sparks into the dry night wind. Smoke rolled thick and acrid up Main Street, stinging Elias Harlan's eyes even from the second-floor window of Lynn Mayan and Gwyn's laundry. The Sharps lay steady on its bipod, barrel still warm from the first 3 shots. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the dirt below. Cleet Weasel Boone crumpled near the hitching rail. Hank Dutch Malone slumped against an overturned barrel. Luther Snake Grimes face down in the alley mouth. The rifle's report still echoed faintly off the ridge, a rolling ghost of itself. Elias worked the breech block with mechanical calm. The spent brass clinked against the floorboards behind him. 4 now, if he counted the one still smoking from Rufus's chest. But Rufus wasn't dead. Not yet. The man had staggered across the street after the first shot, clutching his side, and disappeared through the bank's side door. Now the faint clink of glass bottles carried on the wind. More coal oil, more threat. Inside the saloon, chaos had given way to something colder. Caleb Blackjack Harlan stood near the shattered front window, one arm locked around Clara Beaumont's throat, the other holding a cocked revolver to her temple. Clara's face was pale, streaked with soot, but her eyes burned steady. She didn't struggle. She waited. Caleb's voice cut through the smoke, raw and furious. "I know who you are, Reaper." The name landed like a hammer on iron. "I heard the stories. Union Sharpshooter, 200 confirmed kills from half a mile out. Hiding out here like some broken old dog. Come out. Show yourself, or I put a bullet in this woman's head and burn the rest of this town to cinders." The words carried to the miners, huddled in doorways up and down the street. They carried to young Billy Whitaker, still bound and gagged behind the bar, eyes wide and locked on the upstairs window across the way. Billy's gaze found Elias. Found the silhouette against the lamplight, the long barrel glinting once in the fire's glow. The boy's eyes changed. Not fear exactly, recognition. The old man who'd once let him win at checkers, who'd taught him how to whittle a whistle from willow, who'd always seemed harmless and kind. That old man held death in his hands. Billy's shoulders sagged. Something in him broke quietly, the way a young tree snaps under too much snow. Elias felt it through the scope like a physical blow. He lowered the muzzle a fraction. His whisper was barely audible, even to himself. "Joey, this time I'm choosing different than you. I'm choosing to protect, not just to kill." The words tasted like ash. He swung the crosshair back to Caleb. The scarred man's head filled the circle, scar running white against flushed skin, eyes wild with rage, and something close to triumph. Clara's hair brushed the revolver barrel. Billy's muffled breathing rasped in the background. Elias's hands were rock steady now. No tremor, no shake. The Reaper had come home, slipping into his bones like an old coat. The moment felt clean, inevitable, and utterly wrong. He exhaled 4 counts. The sharps cracked again, sharp, final. Caleb's throat bloomed dark red. The revolver slipped from his fingers, clattered to the floor. He released Clara and staggered backward, hands clawing at the wound. He hit the bar rail, slid down it slow, eyes still open, staring at nothing. Clara dropped to her knees, gasping, hands at her throat. She didn't look up. She just breathed. But the night wasn't finished. From the bank across the street came the unmistakable gurgle of more coal oil pouring, thick, deliberate. Rufus emerged at the second-floor window of the bank, shirt soaked crimson, face pale with pain and fury. He held a lantern in one hand, a bottle of oil in the other. He smashed the bottle against the sill. Liquid splashed down the wall, catching the firelight in oily rainbows. Then he raised the lantern high. "You think that's the end, Reaper?" Rufus's voice cracked, hoarse with blood and smoke. "I'll take the whole damn block with me." He smashed the lantern against the frame. Flame erupted along the eaves, racing toward the hardware store next door, toward the barrels of blasting powder stored in back for the old mine works. The wind pushed hard now, feeding the blaze, sending it leaping from building to building. Elias worked the bolt again. 1 round left. Through the scope, he tracked Rufus. Saw the man's chest rise and fall. Saw the blood bubbling at his lips. Saw the wild, dying light in his eyes. 1 clean shot, and it would end. 1 shot, and the fire might still be stopped before it reached the powder. But the flames were already licking the back wall of the saloon. Clara was on her feet now, dragging Billy toward the rear door, coughing, half blind from smoke. Miners shouted from the street, buckets clanging as they formed a ragged line to the horse trough. Elias's finger hovered on the trigger. The sharps felt heavier than it ever had. He could end it. He could save what was left. Or he could wait, 1 heartbeat, 2, and let the fire decide. The night pressed in, smoke curling through the open window, stinging his eyes, filling his lungs with the smell of burning pine and coal oil, and something far older. Something that tasted like Gettysburg, like Antietam, like every battlefield he'd tried to leave behind. He exhaled once more, and the crosshairs settled. The night had turned the color of old blood and fresh coal. Flames roared along the eaves of the bank, the post office, the hardware store. 3 buildings fused into 1 hungry beast by the wind. Sparks swirled upward like dying stars, carried on gusts that smelled of burning pine tar, scorched wool, and the faint, sick sweet bite of blasting powder beginning to sweat in the heat. Main Street Silver Gulch was no longer a street. It was a furnace corridor, shadows leaping wild across the false front facades. Elias Harlan remained prone in the laundry's second-floor window, the Sharp's rifle still warm against his cheek. 4 empty cases lay scattered behind him like spent promises. The scope's circle framed the bank's second-floor window. Rufus Harlan, blood-soaked shirt clinging to his chest, 1 arm braced on the sill, the other raising a fresh lantern high. His face was pale as bone, lips pulled back in a rictus grin that had nothing to do with humor. Rufus's voice cracked across the roar of the fire. "You killed my brother, Reaper. Now you get to watch it all burn. Every board, every soul. Your little hidey-hole town." He smashed the lantern against the frame. Flame exploded outward, racing along the roofline toward the hardware store. A low, ominous pop sounded from inside. Blasting powder tins, heating, seams weeping nitro. The wind shoved the blaze harder, sending tongues of fire licking the back wall of Clara Beaumont's saloon. From inside the saloon came Clara's scream, sharp, raw, not for herself, but for the boy. Young Billy Whitaker was still trapped behind the bar, bound, gagged, smoke pouring in through the broken windows. His muffled cries cut through the crackle of burning wood like a knife. Elias shifted the crosshair. Rufus filled the glass, chest rising, falling, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. One shot, one clean end. His whisper was barely louder than his own heartbeat. "Joey, this time I choose to save. Even if the price is, I never forget." The words tasted like gunpowder and regret. His hands were stone steady, no tremor. The Reaper had taken full possession, slipping into muscle and bone as easily as breath. He exhaled 4 counts. The sharps bucked against his shoulder, a single flat report swallowed by the fire's roar. Rufus jerked. The lantern slipped from his fingers, shattered on the sill, and flame bloomed outward in a bright, angry flower. Rufus toppled backward, disappearing from the window frame with a dull thud that Elias felt more than heard. The rifle slipped from Elias's grasp. It clattered to the floorboards. The tremor returned, fierce, punishing, worse than before. His hands shook so violently they blurred in his vision. He pushed himself up on trembling arms, knees buckling once before he caught the windowsill. Below, the street had become a battlefield of light and shadow. Miners and shopkeepers poured from doorways, with buckets, blankets, anything that might smother flame. Dr. Elias Sawbones Thorne ran toward the saloon's back door, medical bags slapping against his hip. Lin Mai Nguyen was already there, ripping wet burlap from a rain barrel, pressing it over her mouth as she plunged into the smoke. Clara staggered out the rear, coughing, one arm wrapped around Billy. The boy's eyes were wide, unseeing. Shock had stolen his voice. Clara's left sleeve smoked. Angry red burns blistered the skin of her forearm, where she'd shielded the boy from falling embers. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, pulling Billy against her, rocking him as though he were much smaller. The fire had eaten half the saloon's back wall. Timbers groaned, sagged. The hardware store's roof popped again, sharper this time, as powder tins heated toward detonation. Men shouted, forming a chain to the horse trough, water splashing in frantic arcs. The blaze hissed and fought, but the line held. Just. Elias stood in the open window, coat hanging open, face streaked with soot and sweat. The tremor racked him now, shoulders, arms, legs, like a fever breaking. He gripped the sill until his knuckles bled white. No one looked up at him. Not yet. But they would. Clara lifted her head, eyes finding the upstairs window. She saw him. Saw the rifle on the floor behind him, saw the empty cases glinting in the firelight. Her expression didn't change. No gratitude, no horror, just a long, quiet recognition. Billy, still pressed against her, followed her gaze. The boy's eyes met Elias's across the smoke and flame. There was no spark left in them, only the hollow understanding of a child who had just learned heroes bleed the same as monsters. Elias looked away first. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of charred wood and spent powder, and something deeper, something that tasted like every battlefield he'd ever walked away from. He stepped back from the window. His legs nearly gave. He leaned against the wall, sliding down, until he sat on the floorboards beside the fallen sharps. The rifle lay there, silent now, barrel cooling in the draft. Down below, the fire still fought, but the townsfolk were winning. Barely, buckets hissed. Voices called names. Someone shouted for more water. Elias closed his eyes. The tremor kept coming, wave after wave, reminding him that the Reaper had only borrowed his body for a night. The price was already being collected, and dawn was still hours away. A few days had passed since the fire, and winter had come early to Silver Gulch. The first snow fell in thin, silent flakes, dusting the charred timbers and the half-rebuilt porch of Whitaker's General Store. Elias Harlan sat in the old rocker outside the store, the same chair that had held him through 13 quiet years. A light coat of ash still clung to the wood, gray against the faded green paint. The seat creaked as he shifted, slow and deliberate. His hands shook around the tin cup, worse than before. Deep, relentless tremors that made the black coffee ripple like a pond in wind. He lifted it anyway, brought it to his lips. A few drops spilled onto his coat sleeve. He didn't wipe them away. Main Street lay quiet under the gray sky. Men moved with shovels and hammers, clearing debris from the saloon's ruined back half. Clara Beaumont's place stood scarred but stubborn. The front wall still upright. The new sign already nailed above the doors, Warrior's Rest, painted in careful white letters on a salvaged plank. Smoke still rose in thin threads from the blackened beams, carrying the faint, lingering smell of wet char and cold iron. Elias watched them work. No one met his eyes for long. A miner paused with a bucket, glanced his way, then looked down quick. A woman pulling a child along the boardwalk hurried her step. Gratitude and fear walked side by side in their glances. Two things that never quite learned to share the same space. Young Billy Whitaker came out of the store without a word. The boy carried the old checkers board under one arm, the pieces rattling softly inside the box. His face still carried the faint purple shadow of a bruise under one eye. But the real mark was deeper, quieter. He set the board on the small crate beside Elias's chair, opened it, and began placing pieces without looking up. Elias watched the boy's hands, steady, careful. Billy didn't speak. He just moved the red checker forward one square, then waited. Elias set the cup down on the arm of the rocker. His fingers trembled so hard, the tin rattled against the wood. He stared at them, at the lines etched deep into the skin, at the tremor that had become part of him now, heavier, more honest. "Joey," he whispered, so low the snow swallowed it. "I still shake. But now, I shake because I chose right." The words hung there, small against the quiet street. Lin Mai Nguyen appeared from the alley beside the store, carrying a fresh pot of coffee wrapped in a clean cloth. She poured without asking, set the cup in his shaking hand, steadying it for a moment with her own. Her fingers were warm, calloused from years of ironing and bandages. She didn't speak either, just nodded once, the same small nod she'd given him from doorways and shadows. Down the street, Dr. Elias Sawbones Thorne knelt beside Clara on the saloon steps. He unwound a bandage from her burned forearm, applied fresh salve, wrapped it again with gentle, practiced motions. Clara winced once, but didn't pull away. She looked toward Elias's porch, met his gaze for a long second, then turned back to the doctor. Elias lifted the new cup. The coffee steamed in the cold air. He drank slow, letting the heat burn down his throat. The town had changed. His house at the edge, half gutted by stray embers in the chaos, stood empty now. He slept on a cot in Mai's back room, listening to the soft sounds of her breathing at night, the creak of the building settling, the quiet life he'd built, the one where no one asked questions and no one looked too close, was gone. They knew now. They knew the name Reaper, knew the rifle, knew the 5 shots that had saved them and cost them half a street. A stranger rode in on the morning stage. Tall, gaunt, Union blue coat faded almost to gray. A veteran by the limp and the way his own hands shook when he took the reins. He tied his horse outside the saloon, glanced toward Elias's porch, then looked away quick. But Elias saw the recognition. Another one coming. Another ghost looking for a place to rest. Billy moved another checker. Elias reached out, slow, deliberate, and slid his black piece forward. The boy didn't smile, didn't speak. He just played. Snow continued to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the scars on the street. Elias looked at his hands again, the tremor, the coffee trembling in the cup. And for the first time in years, he didn't try to still them. He let them shake. The flakes gathered on his coat, on the rocker's arms, on the checkers board between him and the boy. Somewhere down the street, a hammer rang against nail, slow, rhythmic, building something new from what the fire had taken. Elias exhaled, breath clouding white in the cold. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know how many more ghosts would find their way here, or how long the town would let him stay. But he stayed seated. And for the first time since Appomattox, the shaking didn't feel like punishment. It felt like proof he was still alive. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.